Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for Harnessing Your Competitive Advantage Through Your Disability Story. My name's Renee Forsythe. I am the Director of Professional Development for Lyme Connect, and in a moment I'll tell you a little bit about what Lyme Connect is all about and who we are, and then we'll get to our panel discussion. This is my first time at NatCon. I am thrilled to be with you all and look forward to some great dialogue today. So for our agenda today, we'll do some introductions. I'm going to actually hold on introducing the panel until we get to some questions. I'm going to take you through a little bit about Lyme Connect before we get into that. I promise it's only a few slides. We'll talk a little bit about disclosure and talking about your disability in different situations. We'll discuss with the panel how disclosing your disability and talking about it through storytelling can be a competitive advantage. And then we want to leave enough time for a Q&A and for you all to ask the questions that you may have brought to this session. So first of all, Lyme Connect is a not-for-profit organization. Our mission is to rebrand disability through achievement. And we do that by attracting, preparing, and connecting high-potential professionals and university students. And we are really committed to getting more veterans into our network who have disabilities. Once individuals join our network, they are eligible to apply for different scholarships, leadership programs, internships, and full-time careers with the world's leading corporations, our partners, many of whom are here today, and we have one of our panelists is also from one of our corporate partners and also one of our board members. Once these corporations partner with us, part of what we do for them as part of the partnership is to support them in their recruiting, onboarding, development, and retention and promotion of all their employees who have disabilities. So just, again, a little bit more about what we do at Lyme Connect and the tools that we use to help you get set up for success. This is one of our network members, Ariel Small. He is a Lyme Network member. He was part of our fellowship program in 2014, a University of Pennsylvania graduate, and he was a captain in the Army 75th Ranger Regiment. So his quotes here help us highlight some of the key tools that we provide. Confidence. As Ariel says, through my experience with Lyme Connect, I grew so much as a person, learned that my disability can be transformed to foster success in my life, and I gained a new lens from which to view the world. We're also really big about community and providing an opportunity for you to connect with other people with disabilities. Ariel says, I've never met such a resilient, intelligent, and thoughtful group of individuals before who live with different disabilities and tap into those disabilities to strive for and achieve success. And finally, connections. I talked about our partnership. That's a big reason why corporate partners connect with Lyme Connect, because they want to get to know different potential employees, interns with disabilities. So Ariel talks about, when I transitioned out of the Army, I was able to leverage Lyme Connect's networking events to broaden my exposure to top-tier companies while not in their direct pipeline recruiting efforts. This really helped me expand my opportunity set and set me up for success. So those are a few of the things you can think about in terms of joining the network. There is no fee to join the network. You just fill out a profile, so it's all upside, and I encourage any of you who are veterans with disabilities to join the network. So just to kind of set the stage for what we're discussing today, we're talking about disability, and we refer to the Student Veteran Association's own statistics about the impact of disability within the community when they indicate that close to 60% of members have a VA-related disability or have applied for one. So that's just a VA-related disability, but we also know that there are veterans who have non-service related disabilities too, which might include learning disabilities. So if anyone is a veteran with any type of disability, VA-related or not, you're eligible to join our network, and that relates to what we will be talking about with the panel today. So just really quickly to let you know how we talk about disclosure at Lyme Connect, and this is one of the benefits. If you join the network, you can sign up for individual coaching about disclosing. You can attend different webinars where we talk about disclosing your disability, how to navigate that process, whether it's in the career search or whether it's in the university. But we talk about it at Lyme Connect in terms of whether, when, and how. So we're not here saying that you should all disclose in every type of setting. It's a personal decision. We're just here to provide you with the tools and help coach you and figure out when you can disclose to set you up for success. So this is a whole different webinar or presentation. I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but I'm just going to skip to the how, because with the panel we will talk about whether to disclose, like their own experiences about what goes into their decision around disclosure. You all have your own personal preferences or feelings about disclosing. So we're not going to get too much into that in the presentation, but this is how we talk about disclosing and requesting an accommodation through Lyme Connect. First, you'd want to establish the reason for the conversation. So maybe you need an accommodation in the recruiting process or in the workplace, or maybe you just want to let people know how to interact with you. So it really depends on what your reason is for the conversation. Then again, depending on what stage you are or what setting you're in, you'll want to establish the right person for that conversation. And then we'll get into talking about this in terms of weaving it into your personal story. So you may have a lot of experience with your disability or a lot of history, a lot of medical knowledge. That's not something you'd necessarily want to bring into these disclosure conversations. You'd want to keep it simple. You might need to share some of the limitations that might be impacting you, whether it's in the workplace or at school or in the recruiting process. But we always come from a strengths-based perspective. So living with a disability has shaped who you are. It's given you very specific strengths that you're going to bring to any situation. And so we also like to highlight the strengths that come out of living with a disability. And then finally, you'd make the ask, be part of the solution. You know what might work best for you. Maybe it works best for you in your personal life, and see how that can transition into the setting that you're asking for the accommodation. So those are the steps. Again, I went through that really quickly, but if you need more on that, that's something we're happy to work with you on. So we're going to jump into the panel now. And I'm really excited to have all of these people here with us talking about their experiences. We'll start out with some introductions. And Maureen, since you're right here, if you could tell us a little bit about you, who you are, your military experience, what brought you to the military branch, where served.
Sure.
All of that good information. Thanks.
Happy to. Thank you all for making time to come to this panel. We really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you. So I am a U.S. Army veteran. I served in the military from 2001 to 2006 as a counterintelligence agent, and then spent the next 15 years as a military spouse. And I'm very proud to say that as of last month, I am now a retiree's spouse, so I am free from the military spouse life. And I don't come from a very service-oriented family as far as military service goes, but we have a lot of cops and firefighters and EMS in my family, and so service was just something I was raised with, and I knew from a young age that I wanted to join the military, but I didn't really understand much about it. So tried to graduate high school and join right out of high school, but I graduated a little young and couldn't. So tried every job under the sun. I drove an armored car, I worked at a Dairy Queen, I managed a movie theater, and it just didn't satisfy that desire to serve that I had. So I ended up joining the Army to be a counterintelligence agent. And then right at basic training, I got hurt. And I kind of pushed through the pain. And of course, being a woman and being in the military, the doctors really just gave me a 2-week profile and ibuprofen and water and told me to walk it off. And unfortunately, it degraded to the point where I had to separate from the service after 5 years, which broke my heart, because I had dreamed of being a 20-year, at least, careerist. And so I actually, after getting out, spent about 2 years just learning to live with my newly acquired disabilities and being a stay-at-home mom at the same time, which was quite a challenge since the Army, in its infinite wisdom, sent my husband overseas to Korea for 22 months. So my transition story was a lot of fun. But the time that I spent in the military really shaped and formed who I am and how I go about solving challenges and obstacles, including learning to live with my disability. And so I look forward to answering some of the questions that I know Renee has prepared for us to talk about how that has shaped and influenced the last 15 years of my life as a person with multiple disabilities.
Thank you, Maureen. Derek? Yep.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Derek, and much like Maureen here, I'm also an Army veteran, unfortunately. Should have gone Space Force. But I was in '04 for about 5 years, and I, as well, also had a pretty severe injury when I was in. I had a brain hemorrhage, which ultimately required me to leave the military. With that, I actually went the other route. I spent probably about 4 or 5 years denying that I had any issues to myself and really putting myself through much more difficulty than I needed to by trying to really say there's nothing wrong with me, it's everybody else, which is an easy way to look at it. I ultimately started working with veterans in the veteran realm with the Joining Forces Initiative at the White House for First Lady Michelle Obama. And there I started really hearing a lot of stories. I started seeing a lot of things at the national level, some of the issues that people were having, and it kind of related back to myself. And I continued down that path, and I worked at Wounded Warrior Project, American Legion, at SVA, you name it. And there's always a common theme that I see with veterans. After you transition out, your own disability is a transition process as well, and everybody can accept it, deny it. It happens at their own pace. So much like the life cycle of getting out of the military and finding a job, going to school, having a family, coming to terms with your own limitations also has a life cycle. One thing I do like to always try and remind people, your disability is part of who you are, but it doesn't define who you are. It's not your defining factor as a human being. So it is important to understand where your left and right boundaries are, but you don't have to keep those up and make it the person who you are. You know, you can always push those boundaries further and further if you find that you can. So.
Thanks, Derek. Those are great words to start with. Jason, if you want to tell us a little bit about you and PwC's commitment to veterans.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's great to be back in front of all of you and be back at SVA. I've been attending SVA NatCon off and on for about 6-7 years now. And even though I wasn't in the military, I am an ally, so I guess I helped to diversify our panel in several different ways besides the matching mask. And one of the areas that I deal with, or in my role, I actually lead overall compliance around employment practices at PwC firm-wide across the US. And within PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, if you're not familiar with the acronym, when you were mentioning the Joining Forces Initiative, Derek, we actually joined, we're one of the leading businesses that participated in the Joining Forces Initiative. And over several years, through our commitment with our charitable foundation primarily, we've been working closely with SVA to help develop empirical research that helps to drive and show a lot of the attitudinal and directional forces by which transitioning veterans are entering into the workplace. What happens when you leave the military, transitioning into college, and then how do you make your career paths? You're going to hear more about it during the conference, or if you've been following it, the Life Cycle Atlas project. That's something that PwC has been underwriting and has donated several $million toward that. So between that and other organizations with which we've made commitments, whether it's with 4Block, Hire Our Heroes, and others, and there's a whole host of them, I'm not going to go through the litany of all of them, we do believe that leaders serve at PwC. And one of the areas I'll talk about a little bit more is this idea of what it means to have a competitive advantage, or bringing your whole self to a business or a corporate sort of workplace and work style. And what's critical or important to think about as you hear each of our different perspectives is, how does it relate to you? And what can you, in your experiences, how do you come to someone like me and explain that to me? Well, we're looking for the best talent out there. It's part of the reason why we're here. So we'll go more into a lot of what we've been doing, but a lot of our focuses have been really on how do we help to bring the authentic self to all the individuals who want to come to PwC, and we have tools, which I'll talk about a little bit later, around how do we do that.
Great, thanks, Jason. And we're so glad PwC is working on that research, and we look forward to your perspective on this panel. So before we go too deep, you both touched on it a little bit about your disability, but if we can explore that a little bit more, how your disability impacts you, and maybe we'll just combine some questions. And really, we know that disclosure is a personal choice. We kind of talked about that. So what goes into your decision about when, how you talk about it, what factors need to be present? So Maureen, if you want to start off.
Sure. So just to, looking at me, it's very difficult to tell that I have any sort of disabilities. All of mine are invisible, and I think that's a part of the conversation that is important to have is apparent versus invisible disabilities. And sometimes it can be very challenging to overcome the stigma that many of us left the military with around disability. A lot of us don't actually identify as a person with a disability because, you don't want to be that person in the rear with the gear. There's kind of this weakness that you're told you have if you talk about things that are hurting or that you're struggling. And so as someone with invisible disabilities, I struggle with the assumptions that most of the population makes that I'm fully and physically abled at all times because you can't see what I'm dealing with. So I live with a TBI, which makes executive functioning very challenging. And I definitely need patience from my coworkers because I will forget about things that are even on my calendar they've texted to remind me about. But I make the choice to disclose to them so they can understand it's not that I don't care or I'm not paying attention, it's that this is something that I have a medical issue with that I'm struggling with, and here's how you can support me. I also live with Ptsd, which compounds the impact of the TBI, which I'm sure many of us out here deal with that lovely combination. But what that does, and when it comes to disclosing, that one's a little harder for me to disclose because it's related to MST. And so recently I actually led a hearing on MST and on the claims process. And during that hearing, it was a very challenging emotional time for me. And so I took the time to disclose with my coworkers in a calm setting. I didn't talk about what happened, but I talked about what MST was and the impact that it had on me and some of the challenges that I faced as I went through the hearing. And I think what's most important in the disclosure conversation is how you can support me or what accommodations I need in order to be successful. And then on top of that, I have some physical disabilities. So standing for more than 5 minutes of time, carrying large amounts of weight, walking very far distances, those are all challenging for me. But I have that military mentality of bootstrap, right? And so I will push myself too far. And so sometimes I actually disclose as a balance and a check because my coworkers will watch out for me and be like, is this something that you're capable of doing? Are you pushing yourself too hard? Because they don't want me injured and out of the office for the next couple of days as I recover because I tried to push through the pain. Now, when we talk about in the interview process, because I think for a lot of student veterans, your next step is going to be finding a job. The decision of when to disclose and who to disclose to can be challenging. And I didn't know who you needed to disclose to. And so to me, I think it was really important to understand that for most organizations, HR is who you disclose that information to. When I first left the military, I just disclosed everything to everyone because we have integrity. We talk about everything. We're like, oh, I'm totally broken, ha, ha, ha. Employers didn't think that was all that funny. And so I had to learn how to have the conversation about disclosure, what and when to disclose, and the reason behind that disclosure. And really, if I'm not advocating for something, or if there's nothing that I need to accommodate my disability, I don't need to disclose that. I don't have to do that anymore. And that took a while for me to be okay with, because I'm used to being so transparent and forthright from being in the military. So I'll kick it to you now, Derek.
Yeah, and a lot of what you said resonates. I think if you go about it long enough, you'll see and hear just about everything, and you'll probably do half of it yourself. So I think, my own personal journey with my disability has lots of ups and downs, and I've seen sometimes where my disability and disclosing it has actually had a negative impact on my employment, and I've seen other times where it's had an extreme positive impact. And I'd say most of the times it was how I came across and trying to ask what I needed that really dictated whether or not it was a positive or negative experience. Something that I always kind of look at, who here has been ever asked the question, what's your biggest weakness during an interview? Yeah, it's super common. My answer is generally always the same. And to really understand it, my brain hemorrhage has left me with some inability with recollection, words specifically, which is ironic since I do a lot of public speaking. Who would have thought? But with that, I usually say, well, spelling. Spelling's my biggest weakness. However, I also look at my poor spelling as one of my strongest strengths. What it requires me to do is reread everything that I do multiple times before I turn it in to my employer. And so not only am I catching my spelling errors, but I'm also really understanding the information that I'm trying to convey. So it acts as a way for me to express to a potential employer that, yes, you're asking me what my biggest weakness is. Don't be surprised if you get, the wrong word, here and there. However, do be surprised when you see that it's a clear and concise argument because I've reread it 10 times. So when you do get asked that question, that might be a good opening for you to try and say, here's something that I'm not great at, but this is also a strength. So try and turn some of your weaknesses back into strengths. Much of what you said, disclosure is very tricky with an employer. If you go into a job interview and you say, yep, I love this job, this would be great. By the way, I'm going to need this from you, and I want that, and I need a standing desk, and you're going to have to do it because of ADA. That's definitely the wrong approach. It's your right to do that, but I think some employers might be turned off by it. I think if you're advocating for yourself during a job interview, say the minimum about any of your weaknesses. Wait till you have the job and then go to HR. HR really is the appropriate person that I've seen. It's the best way to have that interaction with your boss, with having somebody who knows the rules and regulations trying to explain to your boss why they can or cannot just disregard the request. If it's a smaller company and there's not an HR, well, then you have to navigate that a little bit differently. But I think what you said was spot on. Because it's such an individual issue, you need to find what works best for you. And that's what a lot of these groups like Lyme and PwC and SVA are trying to do, is that you can bounce ideas off, see whether or not what you're thinking about doing is at the right time and place. What's the best way to protect yourself? What's the best way to still turn your disability into a strength for yourself and the organization, and talk with somebody who might have already gone down that road?
I do want to add real quick, if I could, one complication to this conversation, especially with federal employment, is the disabled veteran hiring preference and how to navigate that. And I think that that's a bigger conversation that I think we could do in just a couple of minutes, but there are some cases in which you really, it's a difficult thing because you are upfront telling this potential employer, yes, I have a disability, and because of that, I need that hiring preference, but then you're also letting that employer know that you're disabled. And so be prepared for that conversation ahead of time, and like Derek said, be ready to flip what they perceive as a weakness and show them how much it is a strength. But that is one of the things that I think veterans in particular have to navigate when it comes to the conversation around disclosure that most civilians don't have to, because most civilians don't have that federal hiring preference due to their disability. It's a different system.
Yeah, and I think you both touched on the when of our whether, when, and how that we look at, which can be the most challenging. And the when, I would say the most common is when you have a job in hand, they love me, and then now I can ask for an accommodation. But if you're really struggling in the recruiting process, you're not seeing progress or success, you may have to consider having that conversation a little bit earlier, just to get you what you need so you get through the process and get to that offer. So thank you both for those insights. And you both touched on it. I don't know if you want to go any deeper into conversations about disability that maybe didn't go as well and what you learned from it. Either one of you can take the lead on that one.
Yeah. So I actually, ironically, saw this great article on this publicly reviewed website. I think it's very academic in nature. You might have heard of it. It's called Reddit. It's absolutely spectacular. Let's see. It was an individual who had a question. It was disclosing, is on the veteran, it might be somebody in this room, who knows. Disclosing military disabilities to employer. And I'm just going to do a quick few sentences. Hello, just curious if we are legally required to disclose disabilities with employers during the hiring process. Main reason being missing work because of treatment or because you can't make it to work because of your disability. Could they fire you if you tell them that the fact is that they are, sorry, it's Reddit, you know. And is there any protection for us being fired if missing work due to ill or medical care? And it struck me as an interesting question, just given the timing and the nature and coming here today. There are a lot of questions like that. There's a lot of confusion, I think, in our population of what is protected, what's not, what are your rights. And you know, sometimes if you go about it, it can have some negative repercussions. Obviously, when you go down there, you had every Reddit lawyer saying everything, you know, under the sun. Some of it was correct, a lot of it wasn't. A lot of it was just speculation. Do know, though, that you do actually have a lot of rights. The ADA is pretty strong, and you can easily look it up online and see where you know that if you have some protection or not. Now, using those protections is a little bit different, and I think you need to be very careful in trying to say, I'm going to go about this in a very aggressive way because I know I'm protected, because that's going to harm your overall career long term. A good example, and just in my own personal career, I have had some employers who have just flat out said no. And, you know, I would ask for something as simple as, hey, I need to get time off to go to VA appointments and for a terminal illness. So they were like, no, you know, no thanks. Like, you know, we need you here at this time, at this date, and if you can't make it, you can find other employment. Well, that's actually not the case. You are protected. You can go to your medical needs, and every single person is slightly different. I think what's really important when you get stuck in those positions is reach out for help, because the laws change, the rules change. Different employers have different policies, and if you post it online on Reddit, you're going to get a million different answers. But there are the DAN network, SVA, I mean us. Lime Connect. I mean, there are people out here whose job it is to try and help navigate if you want to disclose. I think the most important piece of advice I can give you from my personal experience is make sure everything's in writing. You're not actually required to put it in writing. That's part of the law. You could just verbally say, I need an accommodation. But it gets to be much more difficult, and sometimes it can be frustrating for the person asking for the accommodation if you're like, well, I told you, and the boss is like, sorry, I forgot, you know. And it can feel like they're not caring about it, but really they do. Or maybe they don't. But if you have it in writing, you have a paper trail where you can say, well, at this time I asked for this, and at this date I asked for that. And I think what's most important is if you're going to disclose your disability, have a clear ask. If the ask is, I need to work remotely because of my disability, here's why, and this is why my doctor says it's important, have that clear ask. You don't have to disclose what your disability is. So that's something that can give you a peace of mind, you know. But at the end of the day, if you do have a medical professional that's backing your claim, you do have rights under the law to protect you. So
I think that's a really important point you just made is when we talk about disclosure, you don't actually have to say what your disability is, just that you are disabled. And in certain circumstances, there might be a need for a medical letter. Like when I used academic accommodations at school, they required a letter from my healthcare provider, but all it said was that I needed accommodations. It did not say what my disabilities were. And I think that some of these disabilities are uncomfortable to disclose, especially, you know, something like PTSD from MST or other things you just don't want to talk about, you know, to every person on the street. But I want to talk about two situations I had where disclosure ahead of time did not go right. And they weren't employment related, luckily. I talked about earlier when I told everyone everything and I just didn't get hired. But actually, I went to a Student Veterans of America volunteer event and disclosed prior to that event that I had a disability and what my limitations were. And when I got there, they wanted us to move these big, heavy cinder blocks across the parking lot, which was just not something I could do. And when I went and said, hey, I disclosed ahead of time that I'm disabled, what do you have for me? They said, stand over there and supervise. Now, SVA has come a long way, and I'm not trying to knock them, but I just want to, you know, talk about the situation. And I wasn't the only one. In fact, my best friend who's here in this room had the same situation. And so we just couldn't do the task that was being assigned to us for the service project, despite the fact that we had already disclosed. So what we did was we went off and found someone else and was like, hey, we can't do this, but is there something else that we could do? We ended up folding policeman pants for about 3 hours and became best friends, and, you know, life happens and you move on. But that one didn't go great. And it was very surprising because I'm like, this is a veteran organization, and there's 60% of us that have disabilities. How did this go so wrong? And so, you know, you can also be a very strong advocate to make sure you're leaving the path better for others. And I know now with SVA, if they do a service project, they ask ahead of time what your accommodations are, and they meet those. And then another time, I was with another veteran service organization on a leadership retreat. And I disclosed to you all that I have a difficult time walking for long periods of time. And I was told we will march 6 miles a day. And I was like, great. So I started training for it. Turned out we ended up hiking 26 miles in 24 hours over rugged mountain terrain, like straight up a mountainside, rocks falling down with every step. And so I left that feeling very proud that I had accomplished it, but almost a little bit unseen and defeated because I had made that disclosure ahead of time. I had been promised that my disabilities would be accommodated, and they weren't, by a veteran organization. So we still have a lot of work to go, and there's a lot that we can do for to leave it better than we found it. But Derek gave some great advice about, you know, the when to disclose, who to disclose, and what to disclose. You know, there should always be a reason for your disclosure, because that way people know how and what they can do to be of assistance to you. If you just tell them, I have this, a lot of people haven't experienced that and don't know what to do for it, and then it becomes this kind of stumbling block to the conversation. So you can help support those who want to help by talking about what you need to succeed.
Great, thank you. And Maureen, just to build on Lyme Connect, we host events, we ask for accommodations in advance, and I will tell you, we are constantly still learning. There's new technology, there's things that people in our network are using to self-accommodate that we learn from them. So I think it's also important when it doesn't go well to share that and help the people continue to evolve and the organizations continue to evolve. Jason, I just want to give you an opportunity to, if you want to touch on anything from a corporate perspective. I mean, Derek talked a little bit about, you know, how, you know, it might not always go well, but if you have anything you want to add in this topic?
Sure, and I appreciate the candor and the realness, you know, Maureen and Derek, that you're both bringing to this. I will bring that as well in my comments. I mean, a lot of it, it's tricky to navigate. I'm not going to lie to you. You know, there's a part of my role, like I mentioned before, where I deal and am immersed in managing through regulations and how do we help to enable our business to have our people, and if you're an employee or if it's someone who is applying for a role at PwC, for example, or any of the other places I've worked at prior to coming to PwC, it's all about how do we get the best out of the individual and have a really great experience. I think it's important to take a step back when we look at and talk about sort of what are the big businesses that are here thinking about, and why we come to events like this, and you hear a lot about the ROI, the return on investment. What's the return on investment for all of you, right? So from an employer lens, one aspect for why we're here, and there's an exhibition hall, and hopefully we're not exhibiting this year, unfortunately, but in the past we've been out there meeting all of you and wanting to know more about you, because we're trying to find the best talent out there. And a lot of our competitors are here, some of the leading businesses are here, and hopefully in some of the stories that you've heard Maureen and Derek talk about, you're hopefully typically not seeing it at those big businesses, because, you know, a lot of it really is built around this idea of not only how do you stay within the lines of the regulation. I'm going to do my best not to gesticulate so you don't, you know, have the microphone go like this with me. So, you know, navigate through the lines around what you can and can't do from a regulatory side, and that's something that's a whole other conversation, and I'm happy to talk with you about it after the formal session. But there's also another important component of it, is that it's a two-way dialogue. You'll hear when you start to do research about the American with Disabilities Act, or you've heard Derek and Maureen allude to this, which is this idea of what's known as an interactive dialogue, which is actually a regulatory term. And it's important is because it's a two-way communication that helps the employer like us, or me in this case, because I actually helped to create our workplace accommodations program, helps us know what it is we need to know from let's say, Derek as an employee, so that he can optimize his productivity and bring the best of himself to whatever the task is. So it's not necessarily about what's the diagnosis or what is your doctor telling you about, your actual physicality or ailments or whatever the different types of prognoses are. It's more about what can you do in the workplace, and it's all about how are you able to manage through completing your tasks, like what Maureen talked about with the ability to take 5 minutes or to take rest after standing for 5 minutes. Like if you were to tell me that would be one thing that we would be saying or would be asking you, so how would you envision that working for you? And how can we make that best work? Are the types of assignments that you have really the most appropriate for the accommodation? And then we can have that continuous dialogue. That's the spirit behind the interactive dialogue. Leading employers who, like ours and others who are represented here, this is something that we do day in and day out. So that's just something to keep in mind is that, it's not really about, what's most important to us is being able to know what anyone would need, whether it's someone who has a disability or maybe has some other pressing need, but what do we do to get the best out of your productivity? And we're just talking about the disability angle right now. And then if we talk about, if it's a combination of, having to go, let's say, to, military training events, or maybe doing some work with, back with the branch that you for which you were a former service member, that's added on top of, the disability-related accommodation. So it's a question of, then what's that organizational culture like? So there's a lot of different businesses here. You can certainly ask me about PwC. Andy McCune, who's actually our veterans recruiting leader, he is somewhere here in the building. I thought that was you, Andy. We haven't actually had a chance to meet yet in person. So, we can tell you a lot about our culture because our purpose at PwC is to solve important problems and build trust in society. There's different ways you can iterate it, but that's essentially what we do at PwC. So a lot of our culture is really about how do we enable our people to bring the best that they can and bring their unique perspective to help solve problems for all of our different clients. And that can come in many different shades and so forth. Other organizations will have their own kinds of cultural values as well. And whenever you're going through an interview process or getting to know a different organization, it's okay to ask. One of the things that I've seen over the years in different kinds of panels that we've done at SVA, one of the defining moments, I would say, when you're an employer and you're at that exhibition booth, is someone who actually, when we're having the dialogue, someone who actually either comes with questions or wants to know genuinely about what it's like at PwC or at Prudential or at fill-in-the-blank business or at Raytheon, right? And or come prepared and ask questions about what it's like, what a day in the workplace is like, getting a better understanding of what it could be like at the organization. The other challenge I would say in terms of with what you were sharing, Maureen and Derek, is it definitely is a tricky path, like I was saying before, because you will encounter as you go through, and I'm going to go a little bit into the technicalities here, just because we're talking about the corporate side. Businesses are required under regulations to ask individuals to what's known as self-identify, right? So you might see a form that talks about if you're an individual with a disability, or if you've served with the military, or what's your race/ethnicity, or your gender, things like that. That's actually information we have to collect as businesses. However, there's a tension in the regulations where you actually shouldn't be using that information to make a decision about how you proceed or how someone proceeds in the recruiting process because they're protected characteristics under US law. So there's this interesting tension. And so what we've trained our recruiters over the years, and especially since 2014, since there were some landmark regulations that came out, it's really about how do you build that relationship as a recruiter. And that's how you really distinguish yourself from an employer side when talking to all of you who are here today, right? Or when you're in the exhibition hall, right? Getting to understand and really live through what are the things that we're saying about our culture as a business, and do you actually see it in the conversations and building relationships? Because let's face it, unless you're comfortable networking or having cold conversations with someone randomly, it's difficult to get your foot in the door. Personally, I hate networking, but it's something you have to do when you're in a corporate culture or in a big business culture. So when you're looking at making inroads and how to learn about what an organization is like, it's important to come and ask questions and say, look, what is it like at your organization? Can you tell me a little bit more about how you value veterans, or what do you do for veterans? Kind of like what I was talking about before with the Joining Forces Initiative and what we've been doing with the Life Cycle Atlas Project. So when those forms get filled out, recruiters aren't always necessarily seeing that. So when recruiters are having a discussion with you as someone who they're interested in, it's important for that candidate to let us know, hey, if we want you to have an optimal experience, let us know that you might need more time to complete an interview. Or if you, let's say, or if you're uncomfortable, let's say, going on video, you don't have to necessarily give us the reason why, but it's things like that that become really important, because we want to make it not only a great experience for you, but it's also how to help whoever we're targeting understand that, look, we're a culture that cares, and not many businesses out there are like that. So I think that's something to keep in mind when you're here at the conference and you're starting to get to know other businesses and so forth. The perspective isn't always going to be about, well, just because someone has a disability, we're not going to consider you. It's far from the truth. It's really more along the lines of, how well do you know the organization that you're talking to, and how well can you represent yourself in a way that makes us perk our ears and say, okay, you know what, let's have more of a conversation. And if it were me in my old recruiting days, because I started out my days as a recruiter, we would, I'd say, let's take 15 minutes to have a coffee chat, and let's, talk some more. But it's really being able to get to that level of, being personable and being inquisitive and getting an understanding of what's comfortable before you can start to ask the questions about, when do you disclose and self-disclose and so forth, because it's all about what that organization's culture is going to be like. And I can tell you in my career, I've worked at 10 different organizations, so I can tell you that cultures are very different, and if it's not a culture that fits for you, maybe it's not the best organization for you. And I've left several roles over the years because of that.
Great, thanks, Jason. I think that's a great launching point, to talk about competitive advantage and the strengths that you bring to a discussion and how you can weave it into your story. So I want to spend our last couple minutes talking about that, and I want to leave a few minutes for Q&A. So Maureen is doing 2 storytelling workshops tomorrow. Tomorrow. So you'll be sure to want to check one of those out. But really, if both of you can talk about, Derek, you already mentioned strengths, turning it into a strength, talking about it from a strengths perspective. So Maureen, I'll start with you since you have all the storytelling background. Talking about your disability as a strength and how you can weave it into your overall story. We talk about not sharing every little detail. I know you and I have that conversation as it relates to the military, so would love for you to take the lead on that.
Sure. So I'm just going to take a quick plug. We do have 2 storytelling workshops tomorrow that are interactive. We're not just going to sit here and talk at you. You will be writing and reading and sharing. And the storytelling has been one of the most effective tools I have had in getting a job as a person with a disability. And I'll tell you why. So as Derek touched on it a little bit, you talk about the weakness as a strength, but you can kind of gently disclose through the power of storytelling in your interview. And I'll give you an example. When they ask me, what are some of your strengths, or what are some of the values and things that you bring to this organization? One of the things I talk about was that hike that I mentioned, where I was led to believe something very different was going to happen. And so I use that as an example to talk about the resilience that I showed. I use it to talk about how I learned to advocate for myself and others and leave it better than I came to it. But in that story, and telling the story of climbing this cliff in the middle of Colorado, and every 5 minutes, a tear would leak out of my eye, but I kept going because I knew I had to finish this. Because A, I didn't want to get stuck and die on top of a mountain, but B, I had committed to doing it. And so in telling that story, they have learned that I have a disability without me just saying, hey, I'm disabled, so you're going to have to make some accommodations for me. It's a gentle way to come into the conversation and allow them to become curious and start asking questions. And so by using a good story, and as you'll learn if you come to the workshop, a story versus an anecdote is how that experience changed or shaped you. And that's what's going to be really powerful in that job interview as you share a story. If you share the story about your disability, is you're showing how your disability has changed and shaped you. And what the research is showing, and unfortunately what we as individuals with disabilities still have to get the workforce to understand, is we bring a whole different set of skills to the table as someone who is living with a disability. We look at things differently because we have had to. The normal approach that works for an able-bodied person or an able-minded person isn't what's always going to work for us. So we learn to think outside the box. We learn to make things happen regardless of the barriers that are in our way. And that's really sexy to employers. They're like, oh, tell me more. So then you have that storytelling opportunity where you can give them an example using your disability that gets them curious and starts that interactive conversation so you can really talk about what's needed. And I think I do want to also add, beware of the barracks lawyers, right? We've all heard from people as we leave the military, like, oh, because you're disabled, you're going to get this hiring preference and they have to do these things for you. It's a conversation. And it's called reasonable accommodations. They don't have to do all the different, they don't have to buy you a $1,500 chair to accommodate your back. But it becomes a conversation about what they can do and how they can accommodate you because they want you to bring your best self and they want you to come to their organization because of those skills and that outside of the box thinking and the reason that you have been changed and shaped by your disability, that's really attractive to them. But sometimes they need help understanding that, and that's where storytelling can come in really handy. I don't know if that answered your question.
It was fabulous, perfect.
There's actually something I wanted just to add to that, because in terms of the tactics, one of the things that you'll hear or might experience in interviews, and for those of you who've been through them, sometimes the questions aren't going to be direct, like what's your strength, what's your weakness. The actual trend that you'll see is what are known as behavior-based interview questions, right? So it'll be more along the lines of building in actually almost a story in that. And there's different techniques that you'll hear people talk about, like STAR, other types of methodologies around how do you approach answering these kinds of questions. STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result, I believe. But the whole point of it is that when you're at that point of the face-to-face interview, you're actually at a good point in the recruiting process because now it's really about how well would you as an individual fit within this company's broader culture, whether it's through their competencies, their attributes, whatever are the driving values that make that employee an exemplary employee or leader, right? Like PwC, for example, you can go on our website. We talk about the PwC professional dimension. There's 5 different dimensions, and that's an example of a competency model, just to give you an example. So when you have behavior-based questions, it'll be open-ended. So that open-ended question will give you the opportunity to practice your storytelling and hopefully differentiate yourself because you can talk about not only the resilience or the creativity that your disability may you've had to bring with your disability, but also the leadership skills you've had by being a veteran. I mean, that's 2 great differentiators right there that maybe you haven't thought about capitalizing on, but those are the kinds of things that leaders or that different businesses are looking for in future leaders. So it's just something I think that it's just another subtle plug to go to Maureen's workshops tomorrow because really the idea of storytelling can work its way into interviews. So I just wanted to make sure I at least throw that out there.
And something I have seen in the past, and you actually brought this up, and I'm glad you did, know when it's time to just say, you know what, you're not a good company. There are spectacular companies out there that really do care. They really do. There are companies that you're going to say, hey, I have a disability, and say, you know what, we have a disability coordinator. Let's talk to them. Let's have that open dialogue. Let's try and understand how we can make you the best employee at this organization, because by us working a little bit with you, we'll get 10 times more out of you, and it's a win-win. You'll be happy working here, and you're going to be productive, which is, at the end of the day, if you're at a corporation, that's the goal. Working at Wounded Warrior Project, I would get cases that were a year, 2 years old, where somebody was fighting with their employer, whether it was in the federal government or it was not, and they said, they are legally required to do this for me. And I'm not an attorney, but we have an office, and they would look over everything. They said, yes, they are actually legally required to do this. You have a strong case. You have a few options. You can sue them, which could take a long time, and that's going to leave you in a really, predicament at the organization long term. You can also leave and then sue them as well. But all of that is just mental strain. And after 2 years or a year, or even 6 months, and honestly, after any amount of time where you're really dedicated to your employer and you're asking for something that is as simple as, I want to work harder, this is what I need, If they're not open to even talking to you about that, sometimes the best thing to do is to leave, to find an employer that takes the time to be here, to work with people, to come and sit down and talk about these issues. You know, everybody that's here, they understand that we're all veterans, you know, student veterans that are going to school, trying to find employment. They know that comes with the territory. There is a point in time, just for your own sanity, where you just need to take a step back and say, you know what, you're for the birds, and I'm just going to find the right organization for me. And ultimately, you know, they might go on and make $1 billion. They might run themselves out of business, but that's on them. Doesn't really matter. What's more important is your own sanity, your own mental health, and how you can, you know, be a successful, productive person in society where you feel valued by the organization that you're working for. So if I can give one piece of advice, know when to just say, you know what, I'm going to move on. And just be able to mentally disconnect, find that employer, and just learn from the mistakes, and just know when you might be in a management position and someone says, hey, I have a disability, remember how you might have been treated, or, you know, positive or negative, and try and make sure you give a positive experience for the next person coming through.
I do want to add real quick too, because we haven't discussed it yet. If there are any school officials in here or you know, not students, it's very hard for a veteran because we don't always identify as someone with a disability. When you talk about academic accommodations, we don't A, know what those are, and B, we don't know that we qualify for them. So what you can do as a school certifying official or a hiring manager or recruiter is talk to us about what you do offer. Don't even wait for us to disclose that we have a disability. Just if you're talking to a veteran, or really honestly, you should do it if you're talking to anyone, because not everyone is comfortable disclosing. Tell about what you're doing ahead of time. So if you're a school official, in your orientation, talk about academic accommodations and talk about how you might qualify for them using examples of veterans. Because what happens is, you know, so I have 3 children on the spectrum, so they've lived their whole lives with disabilities. That is the only reason that I knew what academic accommodations were when I went to college. I didn't even think I qualified for them. And so for 2 years, I struggled. I was on the struggle bus hard because I didn't know I had those. So by having that conversation ahead of time and letting me know that that's out there and that that's an option, you're really setting me up for success as a student or as an employee, because you're showing me that you're ready to have that conversation, and I may not even know how much success you're about to set me up for. So I went from barely passing classes, got some very simple accommodations. One was just the ability to type rather than handwrite answers, and went to a 4.0 student while raising 3 children on the spectrum, living life as a military spouse, working for the Graduate Student Association, and running president of my chapter, because I had some very simple accommodations. But until someone talked to me, started that conversation, I had no idea that was anything I could even utilize. So I will put a plug in for something that Derek and I created together back when I was at Paralyzed Veterans of America. And there are 2 videos through Psych Armor. I don't know if you all have heard of them, but if you haven't, you should, because they're a cool organization. But there are 2 videos out there, and one is encouraging students with disabilities to pursue higher education and why that's important. And the one that I'm in, we talk about what academic accommodations are and how they can be beneficial. And we talk about mine and Derek's story and how those accommodations made a difference for both of us as we went through school. So the one thing I wanted to throw in there is, for those of you who aren't the veteran themselves, but who are helping to serve, start the conversation, tell us what you do. That allows for us to be more comfortable disclosing to you.
Perfect, and I think that helps on both sides too, if you are a student here, to look for those resources within your university setting. There is, I'll put our plug in, Maureen expertly moderated a veterans panel for us, Veterans with Disabilities. It is on our website, so you can check that out and learn more. But I think everybody who was on that panel talked about the benefits that they received at their university once they figured out what an accommodation was and what was available to them. So thank you all. I just want to take a few minutes and see if anybody has any questions. I'm going to run the mic over to you.
Oh, he's a mic, look at him.
That's my time.
Thank you so much. My experience with academic accommodations was that I was told that for grad school, applying to grad school, they would be frowned upon, But it wasn't until like my senior year of college that when I'm getting ready to apply to graduation or oh my gosh, I can't talk.
Grad school?
Oh my gosh, I can't talk.
It's okay.
Anyway, that they won't even look at it, or they don't even know unless you disclose. So all my 4 years, I struggled, desiring accommodations and craving, needing them, desperately needing them, but didn't, just because they said it would look bad on your grad application. And only to be told at the very end, they don't know unless you disclose. So I don't know how to, what to do now. Maybe tell them my story on my grad applications, why my grades don't look as great as they should have been, or
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think it's a personal choice for that. One thing I will say is shame on whoever gave you that information, and I hope that was not a school official and maybe a barracks lawyer, but if it was, shame on them. But yes, so, when we talk about academic accommodations, it's just not something we were raised with, right? And so we don't even know how that process works, but it's not something you can ask for in the classroom at the moment. It is something you have to work with your Student Disability Services office to get set up ahead of time. And honestly, sometimes they don't share that information with your professors. So you will have to be the one who's like, hey, here's the accommodations that I have. Let me know if you need any trouble. Here's the contact point for the Student Disability Services. But as far as your question as to whether to disclose in your application, that's a personal choice. If you think that your grades are going to be a reason they wouldn't accept you, then that could be an excellent opportunity. My suggestion would be, don't put it in your personal statement, but save that for your interview. But it all depends on what program you're going for and what the culture of the school is. So that's where you could talk to other students to learn more about. But for me, myself, when I'm applying to schools, I don't put that in there unless it's absolutely relevant to the questions that they're asking. And if I'm using it to teach a story or show the value or skill. So if you think that that's important enough to mention, you sure can. I know another friend of mine had trouble with tests and doesn't always do well on standardized tests. So she wrote a letter explaining why she didn't do well on her GRE. And the school, a very high-profile school, accepted her because she took the time to tell the story about why she struggled with this. So I think it's a personal choice, but you definitely want to frame it in a way that it's showing your strength and, kind of explaining the situation and that you are succeeding. And, but yeah, grad schools don't frown on people using accommodations. I don't know if it's on. I can pass this to you.
Okay. You want to go first, and I'll follow up?
Yeah. So I think that comes into something I kind of touched on at the beginning, is using a viewed weakness and trying to turn it into a positive. So grades, I'm awful at grades. Last grade I completed was 8th grade, and then I joined the military, and then ultimately got my MBA and worked at the White House. So grades have never been in my favor. And I think if you go into it as, hey, my grades aren't that great because I have a disability, that's a tough kind of story to explain. But if you say, I know my grades don't shine, but let me show you what I overcame to get those C's, to get those B's, to get those few A's that I have. I went here, I was in the military, I came from this type of family. I have these disabilities that require a little bit more work, and I still made it all the way through. I think that's the kind of narrative that actually is attractive to an employer, to a graduate school, where they're looking for someone who can show, regardless of whatever is put in front of them, they're still going to continue on. It's easy to be, my wife, she's incredibly smart. She's gotten an A everywhere, but I tell her, you've never been challenged. You should have gone to Harvard. You probably would have been a C student. You would have been challenged. But by showing that you have some deficiencies, but you still continued. If you had deficiencies and you never graduated, that's one thing. I would say go back to school and continue on that fight. It's the fact that you were able to complete it, and you still want to go back for even more punishment. So kudos to you for that. Graduate school is even more difficult at times. So I would just say, use that to your advantage. I know it looks like a downfall, but I did the same thing. My grades weren't great in undergraduate, and I went to, I would say, a stellar graduate program, and I told them that. I said, look, I have some problems. These are my problems, but this is why I will not fail this program, because I won't quit. And I think they took that to heart.
Yeah, and the other thing that I would say is, and Sorry, I don't know your name, but I do want to thank you for being the first one to ask a question, because when you're in a session like this, it's not always easy to be the first one to ask a question. But it's an important area that you highlighted, and one that actually we're really passionate about, or I'm personally passionate about, because one of the things that we've seen over the years in developing our disability recruiting strategy, and over the years our veteran risk recruiting strategy, and Andy, you and I are going to talk about this at some point, is some of the difficulties, and I think it'd be great to get your perspective on this, Renee. I'm going to throw it over to you when I'm done with this. Is this disconnect sometimes that happens, which is getting advice that's counterintuitive, or maybe doesn't comes into conflict, or doesn't jibe with what happens when you go on to building your career, where you have employers like ours and others who want to know the information so that you can be the best you can to succeed. And so how do you go from a culture where you may not be getting the support, because not all DSOs are the same, disability services offices are built the same. Some are going to be on a continuum where they might say, maybe don't disclose, kind of like what Maureen and Derek are talking about. Some are going to be more encouraging, which is just going to be depending upon what that institution is like. But then you think about how that manifests itself, right? When you start to build your career, and the confidence that comes in with how to ask questions during an interview process and so forth. So I know with organizations like Lime Connect, these are things that we've talked about. I'm also on the board of directors for Lime Connect, which I didn't say before, if it's not obvious now, since I'll put my plug in for Lime Connect as well for that. But it's important since you've been encountering this, certainly you can talk to Renee, talk to me, talk to others who've seen this happen, and given the advice or some of the thoughts that Maureen gave and Derek gave and now I'm giving, it's one that it's going to be personal in terms of which route you want to take. But at the end of the day, I would say that when you're going to build a career and trying to find an organization that's really going to embrace all the different facets of yourself, that's going to become more and more easy to start to self-disclose, whether someone is on the LGBTQ plus spectrum, or is a veteran, or has a hidden disability. One of the things that we actually started at PwC is actually what's known as My Story, Your Story, which is this whole initiative around the importance of recognizing that all the different parts of ourselves actually contribute to how we can bring our best solutions and diversified solutions of thought when we're working with our clients. And so one of the ways in which we do that is we've built platforms that we use internally, but we also use it with talking with our clients around who are we when you meet us. It's not just the fact we might have certain skill sets. Like for me, I'm a dog parent, and I'm a New Yorker. I identify myself as New York, if you haven't, again, the matching mask. Mm-hmm. So there's different facets that through My Story, Your Story, all of our 50,000 plus people can go in and self-identify in ways that can help bring authenticity to when they go out and talk about themselves. And it's just a way to build more connections with our clients or with people with whom we're interacting. So, this idea of whether it's turning a weakness into a strength, or developing a story, or just even understanding how to navigate, those are things that are going to come with experience. And I think, Renee, it'd be great to hear from you sort of what you've seen, in your role from a professional development lens around this disconnect that sometimes happens with DSOs.
Yeah, and I think we hear people getting all different types of advice, right? About disclosure. We hear people, my parents told me not to talk about my disability ever. So, we come at it, whether it's applying for a job or applying for graduate school, is figuring out how to put your best self forward. So if going into applying to that particular graduate school that your grades just aren't going to make the mark, you might have to disclose in some way to share why. And I think the examples of how to do that are great because, I'm sorry, I can't breathe, because it becomes, part of your story, part of your resilience, part of what you've overcome. I would say graduate schools, just like corporations, are looking for diversity. So you're a veteran, you bring this unique experience. So talking about it in those ways, in positive ways. But if you're just going to submit your application and you don't make the mark, you might just fall out of the process just because you don't hit the mark. The same thing with some applications for different universities. If they have a GPA cutoff and you haven't explained why your GPA doesn't meet that, then you can just fall out of the process just technically before anybody even looks at it. So I think sometimes it does require an explanation. Other questions? I know we're at time, or can we take one more question? Okay.
Thank you. So my question was about this disconnection you guys are talking about, and it's piggybacking off of the initial question, because, you know, when you try to convey your circumstances, you want to avoid coming off as giving an excuse. But I'm curious how that stigma even develops, or where it even comes from. Do you guys have any opinions on that?
Just to clarify, you mean the stigma?
Of having a disability.
So, so working at Window Warrior Project, I can say that that organization, you know, there's an issue with just labeling every single veteran that is disabled, and you know, every disabled veteran has a problem, and it's going to be a problem for you, and that stigma does exist. I think it's up to all of us, including the VSOs, like Window Warrior Project, SVA, and organizations, try and combat that stigma. And that doesn't happen at a national level easily. It really is a grassroots thing. Every single person has to try and do their part to say, look, it's normal to have a disability. Just being human, you're going to have some problems. We're not all, nobody's perfect. Some people have given a little bit more, and because of that, have a little bit more problems with them. There's no doubt about it, regardless if it's Space Force to Marines, you're not going to leave the military without some issues. And being able to talk about those issues in a positive narrative, saying, this is what I sacrificed, this is what I gave up. Yes, it's going to require some changes, but that just means I'm going to work harder than maybe the next person. And you can expect that from me moving forward for the rest of my life for two reasons. One, because we're all in the military, and that's what we naturally have done while we were served. We just always went forward. And two, you have to. You have to overcome your disability. I mean, it's not saying that you don't have one. It's learning to be with it, to move forward and not let it be you. It's kind of what I opened up with. You know, you might have a disability, but it doesn't define who you are. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to say, hey, I might need some time off for mental health. I know that, some companies don't allow, mental health days, but just say I need a sick day if they're not open to that. It's going to take time. I think after, the U.S.'s longest war in history, there are more and more people that are open to the idea of understanding what we all went through, regardless if you were deployed or not, if you worked at a desk or if you worked in the front line. There's going to be something that you're going to have to deal with, and it's us as a society that have to, as a veteran population, that has to be the forefront in trying to change that stigma, and then hopefully society catches on. So there's no really good answer. All I can say is you won't be able to even know where that person across the table from you stands until you actually try.
And I just want to comment, and then I think we have to wrap. You're going to see all these people coming in and out. I think the pandemic, one of the positives that's come out of it, and this transition to working remotely, is we've seen inside people's lives, and everybody has needs at home, right? So when I talk about accommodations and I coach around that, it's like, this is just another need that you might have if you have an accommodation that you might need. Just like you might need particular training or a certain computer, or people have kids at home and they need to be available for drop-off or pickup or getting them on Zoom for school. So I think we've seen a shift where it's a good time to really, corporations are really thinking differently, So anyway, I think we have to wrap. I know people are looking to run, but I want to say thank you to this amazing panel, and thank you all for joining us. I think we can step in the back if anybody has particular questions, but thank you. It was great having you all here. This is our website, so join our network, please.